now that you're finally into Atlantis, you finished Stargate SG-1 season 7 and you've started watching Atlantis season 1. I thought it's maybe a good time to, on one hand, revisit. We promised that we would revisit the discussion on some of the advanced peoples, including the ancients. We said we would talk about later, and but also to discuss the ending, the conclusion of season 7 of Stargate, which kind of led to Atlantis and move forward to Atlantis, and we can talk about that situation of having the two shows. And so I guess then I would reopen the discussion of our, advanced races. With we had already talked about the Nox, Tolan, and the Asgard. Tolan were not one of the quote unquote Great Four, but the Nox and the Asgard were. And one of them, of course, was the Ancients, who are the gate builders. We find out that they're the builders of the gates, and they're also they became the ascended beings, which we've talked about as well in some previous episodes. So I wanted to know your feelings on the ancients and how they kind of bridged into this conclusion of season 7.
Yeah. So so like I've said before to you privately, I'm always concerned about what I can and cannot remember. So because it's like sometimes I watch these so like condensed, so close together that everything kind of morphs into one. And so I don't always have a clear understanding of remembrance of everything. So just that being said ahead of time, in case I get everything all ass backwards. Um, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's like I feel like, like with the ancients, I mean, I don't know. I still feel like there's always things that are left unknown throughout. I mean, I don't know if that's just the holes in my brain, but it's kind of like as I'm watching it, like I feel like we learn more and more about like what's from the ancients and things like that, and things like you says the gate builders, blah blah blah. But it's like I always still feel like there's like a question there. Like I feel like you never fully know everything. Um, but yeah, I don't know. Like, so what were you asking? You were asking my thoughts on them?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like because like in my like I can kind of tell you how I see it is this is really really like common and um maybe in the sense you have a lot of times you have this sense of um, ethnocentricity in things. And then there's also this temporal centricity or this kind of like historic things where we have in our heads that, and I mean, a lot of times this change as you learn more about history, but especially when you're younger and the way that they present things to you, it's always this idea that everything is always going forward. And the further we go along, the more advanced we get. But I mean, this is a very common like trope in sci-fi and things, but that there's this advanced people that came way, 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 way before you, and actually we're not as evolved or whatever as they were previously. So I always find that interesting. Like I appreciate that because it's kind of building on the a lot of the other concepts in Stargate, which are in a way being a bit critical of this sort of American exceptionalism. They're always very
Hmm.
self-critical of that in the show. They present it, but they also critique it at the same time. And on the other hand, um, I also think it's really interesting that then they use that, the ancients, as a way to say how to demonstrate how parasitical the Goa'uld are, both like metaphorically and in reality, because most of their technology and everything they took from everywhere else, and we found out that their mastery of the Stargates actually took from the ancients. So I mean, on the one hand, I found that kind of concept interesting, and I also found it interesting that they were able to use that to um, sort of illuminate the ascended being concept. Because of course we would question where did they come from, like how can, and you find out that okay, it's this group of people, and they became more evolved and advanced, and they decided this was the ultimate goal of existence, and um, so I thought that part was really interesting. And I also thought it was an interesting way to kind of bridge into the next season and especially the next series, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And I found it interesting because they start showing that people have this like quote unquote ancient gene, and which could be either you could say a new step in evolution or a leftover, because just like even now, some people still have like Neanderthal things in their DNA. So it's a question: is it a leftover, or is it a new step in the evolution? And so, yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of my scattered thoughts and impressions of the ancient. Um, in comparison to kind of the other races, I think they're, in a way, they're much more of an impact on the overall story. I mean, I know the Nox had kind of a minor impact because they're only in a little bit. The Asgard more so because they created the pact with Earth so that we were a protected planet, in terms of the overall story arc. But I think the ancients had an even greater impact because they impacted not only discovery and thinking, but also we gained information that then pushed things extremely forward. So
But yeah, I mean, I think like you bring up like excellent points that like I agree with that I would never think of on my own. Like I'm not trying to down myself, but I'm not that deep. like, I don't know. It's just the way my brain works. Like I didn't really think about it. I just like, I didn't even think about I don't know what this says for me. I didn't even think about the fact that you're right. It's kind of like reversed in the sense of like you says normally like there's that thought of everything gets better over time, like with technology and everything, and then this is actually from the past. I never even entered my brainwave of like even realizing like, oh, that's different. Like that's not usually
do you know why I didn't? It's just probably because I've played so much Final Fantasy and like other JRPGs, and
Ah,
that's like always in JRPGs, they have this like when they're the technological race, there's always like this better like ancient race that clearly knew what they were doing more and had way more control of everything. Or if they are not as technologically advanced, there was definitely a race in the past that was superior to them, and you're kind of uncovering their things. But yeah, so like to me that sticks out, but it really just didn't stick out to you as much because that's not a it's not something that you haven't, I guess, spent
yeah.
the countless hundreds of hours playing like with RPGs.
Yes, I have not, but but yeah, I think the way you described it all was described very well, and I would agree. I don't really think I have like much to add to it because I just like I said, like sometimes I just watch things and it's like I'm in like sometimes there's like a deep thought that goes into something where I'm like, "Oh, I gotta talk to Alyssa about this because I thought of this, regarding something I watched." But then other times I feel like because and maybe this is the risk of binge watching, is that when you binge watch, I feel like sometimes you risk missing certain things because it's like kind of both. Like you sometimes get more information because you're kind of more in the storyline. So it's like making sense more, maybe. But then at the same time, because of binge watching, it kind of can cause, at least for me, my brain to not fully hold on to certain things that happen because like I'm in it in the moment and then it passes out my ear holes. It's like my brain remembers it during the time and then disappears as soon as like I'm done watching it. So apologies if I'm not speaking very well about it all.
No, actually, what I think you bring up is a really, really interesting point, because what you're missing is that reflective period. You don't have like when you actually,
Yeah.
because I notice the same thing. Like when if I watch something like in a row, I notice that like things tend to run together. And while on the one hand, like the benefit you get is you can follow the story easier. You don't miss the sort of the concepts in the story. But I do notice that when I watch something all in a row like that, I usually want to go back and rewatch it, and then I notice things because you're actually missing that reflective period of like when you watch it and then you think about it afterwards and you think, ah, that's interesting about the ancients, because like it's almost like since you're kind of hungering, you have this hunger to see the next thing, then your brain is thinking about it. And as your brain is thinking about it, it's like coming up with all of these, I don't know, concepts and
Yeah.
where it's
Yeah.
like
That's so true. That's so yeah. Yeah.
so
You
so your
figured it out,
observation
Alyssa.
is actually Your observation is actually incredibly astute of what you're saying, and it's, I think, probably very valuable to people that might be watching this podcast that are either having the experience of, binge watching, or that are having the experience of watching Stargate, having watched it in the past, and able to kind of think about those things that maybe you can also think how you consume Stargate.
Yeah, yeah, think about how you consume it because it is important to actually remember it.
I mean, or maybe it's just important to like enjoy. And I think, that being said, something I think is really I love about The Lost City, which you just saw, is that in this episode, there is so much of that classic humor. And I remember we talked about this before where I said, "Hey, wait until you get to The Lost City." Because I think we were talking about a little bit of the humor being pulled a little bit and it being a bit darker in like season
Mhm,
6 and a little bit at the beginning of season 7. And I said, when you get to The Lost City, there's some really classic moments, and I think they know that this is the last episode where the whole team is going to be together in the same form, and so I think they pull a lot of those moments in, and like when they all go and
yeah.
visit O'Neill at his house, it's so. I mean, how did you feel about that? Like, did you also notice that too in this ending that there were some classic moments?
Yeah, yeah, I definitely remember the part when they're all going into the house, and for some reason, I remember that always stood out in my mind as like, do you ever find when you rewatch things that then you'll see certain things within episodes that you realized were in your brain somewhere, but then you remember even more once you've re-seen it again, and you're like, "Oh, I
Hmm.
remember that part from last time," and, like, that part always stood out to me because I thought it was such, like, a funny dynamic and a cute dynamic between all of them, and, um, yeah, I don't remember some of the other, like, funny parts that you mentioned. Probably if you mentioned them, then it would come back to me, but I do know specifically with season 7 that I feel like it really that season to me as a viewer that's, like I said, binge watching it, um, I felt like it really kind of picked up near the end of that season and into season 8 where it's like something about that, like, just made me wanna like, oh, like, I need to keep watching, like, something about it picked up, and maybe part of it is the dynamics and everything that you mentioned that happened within the final 2 like, the two-parter of season 7 is just, like, how it does get back that humor, but then there is a lot going on, a lot of, you know you get introduced to new characters, in terms of, Dr. Weir, and, um even, like, with that, like, I feel like such an idiot with, like, telling you before that I can't even remember if I said this in the last podcast where I was mentioning or maybe it was just in our own personal talk, back and forth, probably. It must have I don't think we would have been talking about it on the podcast, but, with Doctor Weir coming in, like, I was just like to you, I was just like, "Oh, is that the same person that's in Atlantis?" Like and I'm like, "Oh, I recognize her name," like, and then I looked it up and it's a different actress, but that's gotta be the same person, and I didn't even know that she was ever in Stargate SG-1, like, that it was even
Oh, yeah, the connection. But I mean, it makes sense because it was a different actress, and it was all like it's again,
Yeah,
it's
but I
all
didn't even re
yeah.
yeah, I didn't even remember her, like, then coming back as the actual actress. And sorry, I know that kinda gets away with what we were just talking about, but yes, so anyways, my point being before we talk about that maybe is just that, yes, I really loved the two-parters, basically. I really loved, um, you know, just like the dynamics of the characters, but then at the same time there's the part of me that it's like I know that like eventually O'Neill leaves and I don't fully remember how, and like so then there was
Oh,
a part of
no.
me that was like, oh, is it at the end of this, is this how he leaves? But I know like he's still like alive, and like I remember him like kind of being in there throughout until the end of Stargate, little parts here and there, where like I think the final episode is like him sitting at his like cabin or something. Or something. I don't know. That's what my memory remembers. But like so like there was the part of me the two focused on that, I think, where I was just like,
Oh
what's
yeah.
going on with O'Neill? Like, what does that mean for season, 8? Like, is that where he leaves? Like, does he leave in the very beginning? Like, all this stuff. Like, I had forgotten completely, even going into, and I know we're not talking about season 8, but I kind of have to mention, like, I had forgotten completely that he then ran, like,
Right. Yeah,
Start
ran the
yeah,
SGC.
like, he was the general, right? Like, so,
Yep.
like, I completely forgot about that altogether, and so I was just
Mhm.
like, "Oh, cool, so he's still in it right now," like, because I
Oh
know
yeah.
that he leaves, and so, like, um, that alone, I think, is genius how they actually did that, because it actually helps the viewer then when it comes time to him, like, leaving, like,
Yes,
even though I don't
totally.
remember, like, fully, like, how he leaves, but,
It's a
like,
nice
I think that
transition.
helps the viewer get used to him not
Mhm.
being in there in the same way. Um,
Yep.
but yeah,
Totally,
sorry, I
totally.
was rambling on way too long and not really answering your question at all. I should be a politician.
No, no, no. No, that was really good, and I think that it's funny because I've read a lot of people say, like, or and heard a lot of people say that the one of the parts of Stargate that they find, like, the most, like, addictive and, like, you wanna keep rewatching it is the end of like, the lead up into the end of season 7. Like, when you go into
Mhm,
the Lost City and then into the beginning of Atlantis, and I think, that's totally true, and I mean, for me, what I find really remarkable, like, about this scene, just one scene where they're all on the couch and they all come and visit O'Neill, right? And the situation is insane because Anubis is like gonna destroy everyone. Okay, the big baddie that's bigger and badder than any other big baddie. And O'Neill is probably not, they think he's not gonna survive. And everything is falling
mhm,
apart. And then they all go to his house and it's just this perfect scene where like nothing happens. It's just characters interacting with each other. They're goofing around. And then you think, okay, this is exactly like what is so fantastic about Stargate is that they can take this like, that this situation where like anything else it would be like over the top and everything's crazy and like action this and it's so in a way like relaxed and like I just find it
mhm.
really, to me it was it's a very special scene, very special interaction between the
Yeah,
characters. So I found that
yeah,
very special. Oh yeah, and I
yeah,
guess
no,
at the time, the other thing you have is that they have Weir, who has come in to replace Hammond as the person in charge of the SGC because they want civilian control, and it's right at this moment where Anubis is going to attack, so everything is falling apart, and they're sitting on the couch, like
yeah.
helping O'Neill, having beers with him.
Yeah, I think that's like such a great point because I think that's sometimes like the moments that I subconsciously like the most and I don't realize that it's just what you said. Like there's chaos going around them. Like any other show could have had it be like all this insane, like constant, like action or a constant like vibe about it that's just intense. And for me as a viewer, like that's when I get overwhelmed
Yeah, same
because
actually.
I find that like I think and I know we've said this before, but that's like one of the things that I just like I think is genius and love about Stargate is how they are able to have that balance of times when things are serious and times where things are heartbreaking and insane and it gets to be a bit much, but then it brings simmers back down into like very human moments of silliness and or being
Yes.
sarcastic about things in moments where you're just like, dude, would you really be saying that if your life is on the line? O'Neill, would you be that sarcastic? Like, I doubt it, like, but it makes it so much more like lighthearted. And I do feel like this is me kind of going into a topic that we probably should talk about, but I just have to say it, is that I feel like O'Neill's character of sarcasm and how he brings in that humor totally translates once you get to, oh my god, what's his name in Atlantis? Uh, the guy, the brown-haired
Shepherd.
guy, the Shepherd, yeah.
Shepherd?
Yeah,
Colonel
yeah,
Shepherd.
yeah. How he interacts and how he's sarcastic and stuff is very similar to O'Neill, I think, with kind of how
Oh,
they have him
totally.
interact, which then helps give that similar vibe once you transition to that show too. But
Totally,
yeah.
totally, totally. Yeah, I think they do a really good job of trying to like maintain that, like that they have. I don't know. I've one thing I find that is actually really impactful about having O'Neill be in command in this situation and how they, I mean, I guess that then extends to his eventual replacement, it also extends to Colonel Shepard, and they all kind of have their own like brand of what it is.
Mhm,
But I think it's this you are in this position that is extremely you're basically in charge of making sure that the planet doesn't like that the humans aren't destroyed. They're basically saving the world.
mhm,
It's like there's a lot of pressure. And it's this high pressure situation. And somehow I think instead of like everything being all doomsday and pessimism, there is this like in a weird way, there's this pragmaticism, but there's this way of like, ah, well, we just do it. We just get it done. And it just
mhm.
instead of like, okay, like, because I mean, there's always like, characters, and you've seen a little bit of Atlantis now, so you've seen also Rodney's character, who, I mean, he always does get it done, but there's always a little bit of like, kind of, you know, on his side, like a little bit of disagreement, or like he can't do it or whatever. Um, but I think when you have the leaders, like one of my favorite moments ever of like what O'Neill does is in season 3. There's this two-parter with Sokar when they all go to basically quote unquote hell to rescue. I think it's Jacob, right? They rescue Sam's dad,
Mm, yeah,
who was a
yeah.
Tok'ra operative at the time, and they go to the rescue him, and Martouf is all saying, "Well, we can't go until we uncover the memory of Jolinar that Carter has deep in there, because otherwise we don't know how to escape." And O'Neill's like, "It's been done before. Like we don't actually need to know how it was done. We know it has been done, so it can be done." And I like that to me like sums up the attitude, and I kind of love that, and I think that's why that it kind of puts that lightheartedness. That's why like in the face of these extreme situations Ball is threatening O'Neill, and O'Neill can, tell him where to shove it because there's something there, and I think that prevents the show ever from getting that kind of over the top, dramatic and constant suspense, and like those shows that sometimes maybe even also give you that really icky feeling because everything is always,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know if that made
Yeah.
sense, but
No,
yeah.
that part that no, that's perfect. That makes a lot of sense. And I think like that's probably answered the question within myself as to why shows affect me in the way that they do.
Yeah.
Because like I feel like, I've always kind of wondered, like, I just assumed like, oh, it's the subject matter. And so if it's something that's a little bit more dark, then like I have to, like if I watch anything, any kind of show, then like I might feel really crappy after it for a while. So then I have to like lighten it up and watch something else. And I never usually feel like that with Stargate. I mean, there is a slight exception, where, like I said, like last time it was getting a bit dark in certain seasons where I felt like maybe I watched it a little bit more slowly because of that. Like,
Mhm.
because then just the way it affects me, like with how I feel when I watch things. But most of the time, it does do that, like you said, where it has that balance. And then in terms of like to like how you're saying with like O'Neill just as that character, like how he leads and how, even though he's kind of like a sarcastic ass sometimes, like he always truly like cares about like his team and he always like has that optimistic nature to him, even though he may not seem like he does, like he always does. And that's what's kind of like the glue that holds it all together. And I think that's where in times with SG1, at least when maybe even Sam, like, she's a very strong character that always believes you can get something done. And then the times where maybe they've been like beat down in an
Hmm.
episode where then they start to lose that faith. That's when it makes it even more impactful because you're just like,
Totally.
whoa, they think they can't get out of it. Like in times when Teal'c has been like that, where he thinks he can't get out of something when he goes in, and that's maybe going into a way later episode. But um, you know, you just don't imagine that happening when someone is so strong-minded and strong physically. You just don't imagine them, like, giving up, and then, like, when each of these characters have sometimes in different parts of different seasons been in situations where they do, question that, it's almost
Hmm.
even more impactful because of that. Whereas if it was
Absolutely.
a show where it was just like, "Oh, let's shoot a bunch of guns," it just gets, let's get the bad guy, and there's not that element there of all of their different characters, that it eases it out a little bit and makes it that they're, humorous or taking things lightheartedly even when maybe they wouldn't normally be, like, or you wouldn't think logically they would be. That all works really well. So, yeah, I think it's pure genius.
No, I mean, I completely agree. I think absolutely. And I think in the Lost City in particular, you end up in the situation where they think they find Atlantis, and it ends up being this just ancient outpost. That basically they
Mhm.
fly to this one planet to get a ZPM or ZPM, and then they bring it back. And then when they find what is they think is Atlantis, it ends up being just another outpost where they can plug in the ZPM, and then they can. I mean, it ends, of course, like there is this extremely epic. I mean, and this is where like this sort of I guess balance is so amazing in Stargate because you have this scene where they're all sitting there and O'Neill is going to eventually lose his function and die, so they think, and Anubis is coming to kill everyone. The Stargate has been taken over by a civilian who they can't convince, who now they have to convince that they need to go and take care of it, but it's difficult because the person doesn't know them and is also just, trying to the president and the vice president are telling her things that maybe influence her decision, and yet they're sitting there, and then at the end of it, even though you have this like scenes of just complete calm and goofiness, at the end of it is basically this huge battle where O'Neill sits and uses the chair to use to send out the drones and turn the tide of the battle. And then, of course, he's frozen. And so at the end of the season, we don't know what his fate is. So it does end on a little bit of a, if I remember right, right? It's not an end of an episode. It's actually the end of that season. We don't know, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I didn't quite remember. But yeah, so basically it's this situation where in the end it ends very seriously, but there are so many light moments of it that you don't get the same. I mean, I think you're right because I am also one. I'm very affected by like things if it's too much emotionally in that sense. I can't watch it really. And this it's somehow there's always this hope. And like as long as there's this little bit of hope, it is allowing
Yeah.
this feeling. And I love that in Stargate that there's always this little
Yeah.
amount of hope.
And, like, I even like, and this isn't even fully talking about the story, it's kind of talking maybe about more of, like, the technical side of things when people create shows and film things, but, like, I find it really, like, impactful and fascinating how certain things are filmed at times. Like, for
Mm-hmm.
example, at the very end of the second part where, it ends where O'Neill is being frozen basically, but the look in his eye and the shot and the
Yep.
angle that they get it at is so impactful, and it's like, how do they film that? Like, I'm so curious. Like, I'm so curious, like, how do you, like, I'm just really interested in the technical aspects of it too. Like, how do you get a shot like that? Like, how do you do that? And then it just like, and then that just combined with everything with how the actor is acting and then the music and the whole scene, but like it all
It's
comes
amazing.
together.
Yeah.
But like that, yeah, like it's just so cool. Like I just like love that particular scene for some reason at the very end because it's just like it just gets you, man. Like,
A hundred
and then
percent,
it
100%.
ends. Yeah, and then if it's like if you're thinking of watching it during the time of when these came out, like how long did people have to wait until season 8? And even in the beginning of season 8, you still don't fully know what's going on with that
Mm-mm.
with O'Neill. I think it's like a
No,
few episodes in.
it's like one or two. Like, I think they like it opened both season 8 because, and now we can kind of transition into this because what's remarkable here is that at the end of the season, um, the following season is not just opened with a Stargate episode, but it's also opened with Atlantis, which is a new show. And like I guess I mean I don't really think spin-off is a spin-off, but it occurs at the same time, so it's like a concurrent series. Um, I mean, if you think about it, it's just like watching two things happen at the same time.
Mhm,
Um, but what's very fascinating is, I mean, I remember I didn't watch it, but I was living with someone who watched this at the time, and they did. They premiered them same day, right after the other. And
mm.
I mean, now that you've seen some Atlantis, I would love to hear uh, your thoughts on how that kind of quote unquote spun off into that and into the season 8 and then also into Atlantis. I'd like to hear your opinion and reaction and then I mean I'll share mine after because I'm a little bit further into Atlantis. So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one thing that I don't know, I just really love Atlantis, I got very excited because I couldn't really remember much about Atlantis, like, at all, really, so it's kind of like a whole new thing, but, yeah, so, like, how I was going back and saying how initially I texted you saying, "Oh, is this Doctor Weir the same Doctor Weir that's from, like, Atlantis, that leads Atlantis?" And, like, I was all like what I find interesting, so if you take the and I don't know if this is fully answering your question, but if you take, like, those last episodes where because that's where she's introduced is in part 1, right? And
hmm
then part 2, and then the other actress that ends up playing her then comes into season 8
8.
of
Yep.
SG-1, and then obviously then you watch Atlantis with that. But, one thing that stood out to me in terms of, like, that actress in particular is that I felt like, um, the initial actress they had I really recognize her, and I'm assuming maybe during that time she was in a lot of other things because there's something about her face that I just really like. I was just like swore I've seen her in other things before.
For
I don't
sure,
know
for
for
sure.
sure, but I liked her take on the Dr. Elizabeth Weir character. I think she did bring kind of a gentler approach to that character that I'm not sure how that would work fully in terms of having her in the
hmm
full series of Atlantis. Um and so initially like her character, I was interested to see how it would come off on the Atlantis show because I was just like, "Oh, I don't remember" like, what I remembered of Dr. Elizabeth Weir is that, like, of her kind of being a little bit more of, like, an authority kind of leader vibe is how I
Yes,
remember
for sure.
how I thought I remembered her. And so when I saw her as that, it felt like a different person altogether. Um, I can't remember in the two-parter that they didn't have the new actress, right? The two-parter the new actress for Doctor Weir was in season 8 of Stargate, right?
I think they once they in season 8 and then the first episode of Atlantis, then they had the new Elizabeth Weir. But if I
Yeah.
remember right, the Lost City, it was all the first one. So,
Okay. Yeah, and so what I found interesting is the actress that they used then that ended up being the actress for in Atlantis. When she comes in, I don't know if they were trying to have her give a vibe of the actress that came before her, but she felt a lot more like soft spoken and like different than how I remembered her
hmm
being in the show. And then I felt like when I saw the episode where I can't remember if this was the start of Atlantis or if this was in Stargate now, where they're all kind of packing up and getting ready to go to
hmm
Atlantis. That's when I felt like she found herself. Like that's her character. That's the leader that I remember seeing. Prior
totally.
to that, she felt a bit passive for me. That I felt like that wouldn't make sense considering her job of being able to negotiate well and things like that. Like I wouldn't imagine her being that way. And so that's one of the first thoughts I had, that of kind of transitioning into Atlantis. And then when actually going into the episodes of that, I don't know how much you want me to talk about it, but I found the vibe of the characters that end up being the team interesting. Compared to SG1, it's kind of a point that you just mentioned, like, earlier on when you mentioned McKay. Um, First off, I guess I should say I do like McKay now, like I expected once I start watching Atlantis. I do like his
Hmm.
character. How he is when you first see his character in SG1, he just seems like an arrogant ass that I didn't really like, and I'm just like, "Oh, am I gonna like him in the show?" Like, I remember liking him in the show, but I don't like him right now. And so once it got to him, I realized, like, what is so brilliant about his character in particular is that with actually a lot of these characters, they show a humanness that makes sense, where it sometimes gets in the way of their missions. Compared to SG1. Like SG1, they come from a military
Yep.
background, they're used to being in these high pressure situations and they act accordingly. And
Hmm.
Atlantis, you have scientists and different things that, like McKay, right? That I don't think he has any kind of military background, right? I
No.
don't think. And you can tell because he freaks the fudge out. I had to censor myself. Um, he panics with things and he gets so like in a tither that it's like then Shepard needs to tell him to like chill out and just focus so that
Totally.
like he can get stuff done. And like and then it's interesting, and then when the Taylor character comes in, I was interested for that because my daughter's name is Taylor, and I was named after that character, and I couldn't remember how they, came into contact with her, so it was cool to kind of see that, and yeah, I just really like Atlantis. I like the whole vibe. I feel like the vibe of the people that all work together is very different. It's interesting to have a civilian such as Doctor Weir, like, be the head of something, so it's like you can tell, like, she battles with, um, how to make the right choice, whereas I feel like maybe if someone was involved in a military aspect of things, like, they would be very, kind of like how the one guy was in the beginning of I think it
Hammond.
was the first episode of Atlantis. Well, no, not Hammond,
Oh, the like
I
the
don't know
one
his
that
name.
I know who you
He
mean.
ends
Yep.
up getting killed.
Hmm.
Yeah, he's the military guy that then Shepard takes his place
Yes,
because
basically.
that guy dies basically. And that guy was just very, very like typical military, like, gotta get this done and do this and blah blah
Yeah.
blah, and getting mad at people for having any kind of emotion towards a situation. And so yeah, it was just interesting to see the dynamics that are different but yet similar to SG1, but yet very different in a sense with how everyone is in high pressure situations. And that's even like with the other scientist, is his name Zelensky, is
Zelinka.
that it? Zelenka. What was
Zelinka.
Zelensky? Who the what did I just
Zelensky.
make up?
Actually, you didn't. My doctor, when I was a child, was called Dr. Zelensky, so maybe that's what you're thinking of. I don't know.
Maybe, I don't know. But yeah, like even like with him, just like the way like he interacts like with McKay, and like I haven't seen too much of his interaction with everything yet. But yeah, it's just interesting the character dynamics. And again, that's where I think the writers are always amazing with, because it's like that's what pulls you in. But yeah, there is actually one character. I don't know if I want to really mention it. I don't know if I should mention it. It might seem
Go
kind of
ahead,
mean,
mention it.
but
Mention everything. This is the
but
moment to mention it all.
in Atlantis, one thing that like, and I think I've mentioned this to you just privately through text, like,
Hmm.
that I find kind of like weird is Ford.
Hmm.
Ford's character. I don't know what his first name is. Or is that his, no, that's his last name, right?
Mhm. Yes,
Yeah,
but
and
I
he's a
say
member.
yeah, I say nothing.
What?
I won't respond to your comment because we'll revisit this in season 2, but yes, okay. I
Oh, okay. Yeah, what I feel is, like, I feel like it's kind of unfair to his character because I feel like he's currently very forgettable. Like, it's nothing against the actor by any means. The actor is great. Um, I think it's just kind of like the storyline of that character. You don't see much. He's kind of just there. And so far from what I've watched, it's like he just kind of appears and helps out, but there's nothing within his personality that I've seen compared to the strong personalities they show.
Mhm.
With Shepard and Taylor and their dynamic, and then McKay and how wonky he gets, and
True.
Dr. Weir has a very specific vibe to her personality, and I feel like he's just kind of there. And
Yeah.
like I'm just like, in my mind, like, if he was there or not, it wouldn't matter one way or the other to me currently. Now, granted, it sounds to me like that will change, I'm assuming, because of how you're reacting. But unless he leaves, I don't really remember, or something happens to him. I
Yeah,
don't
I say
remember. I will stop. I will stop trying to
yeah.
guess, but
I'll say the one thing I will say, like, I find a shame, like, if we're just talking about, like, season 1, is that, I think that there was a real potential for them to build something in that character, and they probably didn't, like, exploit
yeah.
it. And I think honestly, like what you're saying is 100% true. Like there are, I mean, Zelenka has like a fully developed personality and personality traits, and he's not
Mhm.
even part of the main um
Yeah.
like ensemble cast. And I think there are other even like scientists you maybe see once or twice, and they're also fully like they have much more sort of strong and present personalities. Um, but it's interesting because you mentioned that like when you started watching Atlantis and season 8, that you suddenly start need to keep watching, and that leads to binging. But and of course, so that's why everything's blending together. But I think there's something really interesting when you mentioned that. I was thinking, well, I guess it's kind of like in a way, Atlantis is sort of a return to the beginning of what Stargate was, like that beginning feeling of
Yeah.
like you
Yeah.
just have they just found the Stargate, they're exploring, and it's this newness and the freshness of it. They're in a different galaxy, and they now have a different enemy, and so everything is new and fresh again, which is in a way like you can't really like. Of course, in SG1, the coolness of it is that they're so developed, and the characters are so developed, and the technology is developed, and they've learned a lot, and they have all these allies, and there's this big, but you can never go back to the beginning there because they're, I
Yeah.
mean, that's, how do they put it? Like the toothpaste is already out of the tube or whatever.
But yeah,
um,
no, I totally agree. Yeah, sorry, I don't know if you were continuing or if you had
Yeah,
stopped.
but no, I think that's something like because I find the same that when I watch Atlantis, I am so excited to watch it because it's like, oh, suddenly we're explorers again, and we're in this new environment and we know nothing, and it's kind of like returning to the beginning without returning to the beginning. So it's somehow like a reboot without actually being a reboot, so that you're not just rehashing. So it's actually very, very brilliant. I find it very brilliant, and
Yeah.
yeah, so.
Yeah, and then it's cool how it's connected with, SG1, and, like, I think the first episode of Atlantis has O'Neill in it, and Daniel.
Hmm.
um Wait, did I say that right? I meant the first episode of Atlantis. Is that what I said?
You
I
said
don't know
that.
what I said.
You said
Okay, I
that.
meent that. I just thought I said something different. And
I'd
so
like to know what you
it's
thought you
always
said.
I don't
First
know, I
episode,
thought
what?
like I got the shows confused, I don't know. I thought I said the wrong show by accident, but, yeah, so anyways, like, it's like, I think something is, like, there's, like, this very nerdy part of me that gets so excited just to
Mhm,
see the same characters in a different show, even though it's all kind of connected. So it's kind of like when I see Daniel in Atlantis, I'm just like, "Oh, that's so cool," or see O'Neill, and you're like, "Oh my god, I'm so excited." And it's
mhm,
just because they're in a different show, but yet it's connected, And so, like, when
mhm,
they make their little appearances, I think that's really cool that then that the characters are all kind of linked. And so I think that I would imagine is what maybe made Atlantis, like, such a smooth I don't know if it was a smooth transition actually when it first came out, if people really loved it, I assume so, but, I don't really know, like, since I never watched it at the time it came out, like, do you know, like, if when Atlantis came out, was it very popular from the start?
I mean, it's interesting because I don't know what most people thought, but I know that, as I said, I'm living with somebody that watched it, a few of my housemates watched it, and, um, they actually didn't like it. They thought the characters were kind of like
Really?
carbon copies of the but I think this is really common, and because I think it's, like, something that it's not the same, but it is the same, and so I think it's too easy to make the comparison. I have the
Mm,
same like, I had this feeling when I first watched Stargate seasons 9 and 10. I was like, "Okay, they're not as strong." But then when I watched it the
mhm,
second time, I really, really loved them. Like, I really loved them,
mhm,
and I mean, I would probably say, like, of all the seasons, like, 10 is probably one of my most favorite, seasons ever, and some of my favorite episodes are in there, and I love how everything that comes together and so much of it, um but a lot of people and so I think and it's the same, like, I'm looking forward to watching Universe because I heard so
mhm.
many people say they didn't like Universe, but I'm thinking, "Oh, well, maybe they're just having that same reaction of, well, it's not SG-1 or it's not Atlantis." And so, I mean, I would be curious to actually hear from people in the comments that were around when it came out, like, what was your if you watched it when it was first introduced, I mean, how did you feel? Did you feel the characters
Are you
were
referring to Atlantis?
Yes, Atlantis. Yeah, of
Okay,
course. Yeah.
yeah.
Sorry. I guess that was confusing because I also mentioned universe, but yeah, for sure I would be interested because I mean, it just in my opinion, I mean, the first time I watched Atlantis was I had already seen SG-1 a few times. And I think because someone brought up that the characters were like carbon copies, I expected them to be, but I actually found that the character dynamic was quite different. And I
Yeah,
mean, yeah, you can say, okay, Shepard is kind of like O'Neill, but he's really not. I mean, he's
yeah,
more like flirty and he has a different sense of humor and he's has a little bit different energy than O'Neill, I
yeah.
think. And I mean, the same like Taylor is not really like Teal'c, like someone said, oh, Taylor is
No,
just
not at all.
she's more like a Daniel kind of like if you wanna put her in anything, it's more like a Daniel, but it's not actually like Daniel. And then McKay is not really like Carter at all. I mean, other than they're what can you say? Oh, they're both scientists. Like,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, I don't
so
find any of the characters anything like each other. The only thing that I thought was similar in terms of Shepard and O'Neill was the sarcasm element to it,
totally.
and
Yeah.
that I liked, and I definitely like how all of them are their own characters, like, and in fact, like, I couldn't remember because in my mind, like, with the Taylor character, I remember when I chose to have that name be for my daughter, and I remember thinking, "Oh, she's such a kick-ass character, like, she's this, like, tough, like, chick that fights with a stick,"
Yeah.
and, like, it's just so cool, and not that she's not that, but she's a lot gentler than I remember. Like,
Yes, totally.
I had completely forgotten that she was actually so, like, empathetic and so, like, gentle with how she speaks and, like, um, in my mind, because I'd only watched it that one time before and I remembered scenes where she was practicing fighting and stuff, like, I thought that, like, she was a little bit more tough with her personality, and she's not, at least not yet. I don't know if that changes, but, yeah, so I just really love the character dynamics and don't think they're anything like the characters from SG-1 by any means. Like there might be a similar vibe at times, but I guess
Yep.
one question to maybe end off on is taking from what you can maybe remember from when you're first introduced to the Wraith in
Mhm.
Atlantis versus the
Mhm.
Goa'uld. Which one do you like better?
Oh, that's tough. Because I mean, my I knew of what the rate like, as I said, I was living with people that watched Atlantis, and one of the things they also complained about was the enemy saying that they're kind of very one-sided. I also it's a bit unfair. I watched all of Stargate SG-1 through season 10, before I saw Atlantis, so it's a little bit unfair. But I would say one thing, I mean, of course, on the one hand, I am extremely partial to the Goa'uld because they're rooted in historical things. And I absolutely really love that. That's kind of like I'm big into history. Um, and so this was really interesting to me. But um, I found that in Atlantis, what was kind of nice and a bit refreshing compared to SG1 was that the baddies, the Wraith, there's a little bit more gravity to it. And
Mhm.
I think that is necessary because they're in a place where the technology they have access to is more superior and or is superior. And so I think, I mean, on the one hand, like my first reaction was, oh, they're much more one dimensional, I guess. Like that is my first
Mhm.
knee jerk reaction of okay, they're but at the same time, I think it kind of gives a little bit more because they're so like they're much more, I guess, threatening for lack of a better
Mhm.
word, than a gold. On the whole, the threat is much greater. Uh, I find that you get a little bit more afraid of the wraith
Yeah.
than the gold. Well, what were your thoughts?
Yeah.
I mean, how did you
Yeah.
feel?
What I was like I remember always thinking the Wraiths, like just their look and everything are just so cool. And I didn't really have a thought one way or the other until I started watching Atlantis, and I was just like, "Oh my gosh, I think I love the Wraith so much better than the Goa'uld."
Oh, really? Okay, okay.
Yeah, yeah, and I think I don't really know why. I think part of it is it's like a blend of things. It's like they're more scary.
Hmm.
Their
Yes,
whole
for
look is
sure.
scary. What they do is scary, like how they kill
Hmm.
people. Like they're I can't figure out why some of them wear the thing over their face. I don't understand why. It's like a weird chain thing over their face, but that's pretty cool looking. And like just like their whole thing is just like creepy and like cool looking.
Yes.
And I think like the aesthetic of how they look, there's just something about them that I just really love because of that. Because I'm someone that like way back in the day when it was like, The Walking Dead, I loved watching stuff because I loved the zombies and they're creepy and like, ugh,
Okay. Yeah.
and like and like, yeah, but there's just something, I don't know, there's something about it that I like better, whereas it's kind of like I feel like they're less comical, right? Because it's like I feel like the
Yes. Yeah.
Goa'uld can sometimes be very comical, and it's like
Yeah.
it's like a regular person, then whoosh, glowing eyes, and then they have their voice
Hmm.
change, and it's like sometimes just kind of funny. And so like it feels like less of a threat, even though they are a massive threat, obviously. Both are. Um, but yeah, it's just a new type. I think part of it too is because when you watch so many seasons of the Goa'uld and then you're introduced to a new type of bad character that's so different from it, in my opinion. There's just something nice about that, and maybe that's why I'm kind of swaying more towards the
Hmm.
Wraith in terms of like what my favorite bad guy is.
Oh, totally. I mean, I will love to revisit this with you too after you're introduced to the next bad guy in Stargate. We'll have
Okay,
to like have a total episode about all the different baddies and how we feel
that would
about
be
them.
cool.
But it's
Yeah,
interesting. It's interesting that you brought up. I mean, it's like you're right. It's kind of like a zombie, uh, aesthetic zombies or something like that. They
yeah,
have this like if zombies wore nice clothes or something and had pretty hair. I mean,
yeah.
some of them do, some of them, and they kind of vary in their aesthetic. But yeah, I mean,
Like,
Goa'uld,
wouldn't
they're
it
what?
I was
Would
about
that
to say, wouldn't it be amazing to like get made up by like the makeup artists that do those like things and be made up as a race? Like, I would love that so much.
Yeah, I could see that. You would be a rockin' wraith. Well, I think their motive is also very the Goa'uld, they have this ego and like their egos are always like the downfall. Like they always
Mhm.
in the end, like their egos get them. Like if you wanna if
Yeah,
you the weakness of the Goa'uld is their ego. And with the Wraith,
yeah,
it's not that. They don't have the and
yeah,
so they're much more frightening. To me, anything without an ego is much more frightening.
yeah, yeah. Because the ego is what can like give you a fighting chance, right? Because then they like
just
overestimate what they can do. Yeah.
yeah, just attack their ego, or they get so salty that you offended their ego, they have to like defend. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I would be interested to hear from others if you're watching. What did you think? Are the wraiths scarier than the gold? Who would you rather be in a trapped on a ship with, wraith or gold? I guess
Yeah,
it probably
and
depends
what are
on
your
which.
overall
What are your
Yeah.
overall what?
Sorry, go ahead.
Uh,
What are your overall thoughts about Atlantis, like transitioning into Atlantis? Not about Atlantis itself, because like I've just started it, so no spoilers, people. But what were your thoughts like when you were rewatching or watching for the first time of like going from, if you watched it in order, I suppose, going from SG1 end of season 7 through to season 8 and then
mhm.
starting Atlantis? Like what were your initial thoughts when watching it? So that'd be cool to hear.
Exactly. And do you watch it concurrently? Because we both are, and I love that. I think there's so many even the littlest things that kind of connect are fascinating. So.